The Castles of Athlin and Dunbayne by Ann Radcliffe. Chapter 4. Meanwhile the Earl remained a solitary prisoner in the tower. Uncertain fate was yet suspended over him. He had, however, a magnanimity in his nature which baffled much of the cruel effort of a baron. He had prepared his mind by habitual contemplation for the worst, and although that worst was death, he could now look to it even with serenity. Those violent transports which had assailed him on sight of the baron were, since he was no longer subject to his presence, reduced within their proper limits. Yet he anxiously avoided dwelling on the memory of his father, lest those dreadful sensations should threaten him with returning torture. Whenever he permitted himself to think of the sufferings of the Countess and his sister, his heart melted with a sorrow that almost unnerved him. Much he wished to know how they supported this trial, and much he wished that he could convey to them intelligence of his state. He endeavored to abstract his mind from his situation, and sought to make himself artificial comforts even from the barren objects around him. His chief amusement was in observing the manners and customs of the birds of prey which lodged themselves in the battlements of his tower, and the rapacity of their nature furnished him with too just a parallel to the habits of men. As he was one day standing of the grate which looked upon the castle, observing the progress of these birds, his ear caught the sound of that sweet lute whose notes had once saved him from destruction. It was accompanied by the same melodious voice he had formerly heard, and which now sung with impassioned tenderness the following air. When first the vernal morn of life, being gone my infant eye, fond I surveyed the smiling scene, nor saw the tempest nigh. Hope's bright illusions touched my soul, my young ideas led, and fancy's vivid tints combined, and fairy prospects spread. My guileless heart expanded wide, with filial fondness fraught. Paternal love that heart supplied, with all its fondness sought. But oh, the cruel quick reverse, fate all I loved involved. Pale grief hope's trembling rays dispersed, and fancy's dreams dissolved. Lost in surprise, Osbert stood for some time looking down upon an inner court, whence the sound seemed to arise. After a few minutes he observed a young lady enter from that side on which the tower arose. On her arm rested an elder one, in whose face might be traced the lines of decaying beauty, but it was visible, from the melancholy which crowded her features, that the finger of affliction had bare anticipated the ravages of time. She was dressed in the habit of a widow, and the black veil which shaded her forehead and gave a fine expression to her countenance devolved upon the ground in a length of train and heightened the natural majesty of her figure. She moved with slow steps, and was supported by the young lady whose veil half disclosed a countenance where beauty was touched with sorrow and inimitable expression. The elegance of her form and the dignity of her air proclaimed her to be of distinguished rank. On her arm was hung that lute, whose melody had just charmed the attention of the Earl, who was now fixed in wonder at what he beheld, that was equalled only by his admiration. They retired through a gate on the opposite side of the court, and were seen no more. Osbert followed them with his eyes, which for some time remained fixed upon the door through which they had disappeared, almost insensible of their departure. When he returned to himself, he discovered, as if for the first time, that he was in solitude. He conjectured that these strangers were confined by the oppressive power of the baron, and his eyes were suffused with tears of pity. When he considered that so much beauty and dignity were the unresisting victims of a tyrant, his heart swelled high with indignation. His prison became intolerable to him, and he longed to become at once the champion of virtue and the deliverer of oppressed innocence. The character of Malcolm arose to his mind black with accumulated guilt, and aggravated the detestation with which he had ever contemplated it. The hateful idea nerved his soul with a confidence of revenge. Of the guard who entered, he inquired concerning the strangers, but could obtain no positive information. He came to impart other news, to prepare the Earl for death. The morrow was appointed for his execution. He received the intelligence with the firm hardihood of indignant virtue, disdaining to solicit and disdaining to repine, and his mind yet grasped the idea of revenge. He drove from his thoughts with precipitation the tender ideas of his mother and sister, remembrances which would subdue his fortitude without affecting any beneficial purpose. He was told of the escape of Alleyn. This intelligence gave him inexpressible pleasure, and he knew this faithful youth would undertake to avenge his death. When the news of Alleyn's flight had reached the Baron, his soul was stung with rage, and he called for the guards of the dungeon. They were nowhere to be found, and after a long search it was known that they were fled with their prisoner. The flight of the other captives was also discovered. This circumstance exasperated the passion of Malcolm to the utmost, and he gave orders that the life of the remaining sentinel should be forfeited for the treachery of his comrades, and his own negligence. When recollecting the Earl, whom in the heat of his resentment he had forgot, his heart exulted in the opportunity he afforded of complete revenge, and in the fullness of joy with which he pronounced his sentence, he retracted the condemnation of the trembling Vard. The moment after he had dispatched the messenger with his resolve to the Earl, his heart faltered from its purpose. Such is the alternate violence of evil passions, that they never suffer their subjects to act with consistency, but, torn by conflicting energies, the gratification of one propensity is destruction to the enjoyment of another, and the moment in which they imagine happiness in their grasp is to them the moment of disappointment. Thus it was with the Baron. His soul seemed to attain its full enjoyment in the contemplation of revenge, till the idea of Mary inflamed his heart with an opposite passion. His wishes had caught new ardor from disappointment, for he had heard that Mary had been once in the power of his emissaries, and perhaps the pain which recoils upon the mind from every fruitless effort of wickedness served to increase the energies of his desires. He spurned the thought of relinquishing the pursuit, yet there appeared to be no method of obtaining its object, but by sacrificing his favorite passion, for he had little doubt of obtaining Mary when it should be known that he resolved not to grant the life of the Earl upon any other ransom. The balance of these passions hung in his mind in such nice equilibrium that it was for some time uncertain which would preponderate. Revenge at length yielded to love, but he resolved to preserve the torture of expected death by keeping the Earl ignorant of his reprieve till the last moment. The Earl awaited death with the same stern fortitude with which he received its sentence, and was led from the tower to the platform of the castle, silent and unmoved. He beheld the preparations for his execution, the instruments of death, the guards arranged in files, with an undaunted mind. The glare of externals had no longer power over his imagination. He beheld every object with indifference, but that on which his eye now rested. It was on the murderer, who exhibited himself in all the pride of exulting conquest. He started at the sight, and his soul shrunk back upon itself. Disdaining, however, to appear disconcerted, he endeavored to resume his dignity when the remembrance of his mother, overwhelmed with sorrow, rushed upon his mind and quite unmanned him. The tears started in his eyes, and he sunk senseless on the ground. On recovering, he found himself in his prison, and he was informed that the Baron had granted him a respite. Malcolm, mistaking the cause of disorder in the Earl, thought he had stretched his sufferings to their utmost limits. He therefore had ordered him to be reconveyed to the Tower. A scene so striking and so public as that which had just been performed at the castle of Dunbayne was a subject of discourse to the whole country. It was soon reported to the Countess with a variety of additional circumstances, among which it was affirmed that the Earl had been really executed. Overwhelmed with this intelligence, Matilda relapsed into her former disorder. Sickness had rendered Mary less able to support the shock, and to apply that comfort to the ambitions of her mother, which had once been so successfully administered. The physician pronounced the malady of the Countess to be seated in the mind, and beyond the reach of human skill, when one day a letter was brought to her, the superscription of which was written in the hand of Osbert. She knew the characters, and bursting the seal, read that her son was yet alive, and did not despair of throwing himself once more at her feet. He requested that the remains of his clan might immediately attempt his release. He described in what part of the castle his prison was situated, and thought that by the assistance of long scaling ladders and ropes contrived in the manner he directed, he might be able to effect his escape through the grate. This letter was a reviving cordial to the Countess and to Mary. Alleyn was indefatigable in collecting followers for the enterprise he had engaged in. On receiving intelligence of the safety of the Earl, he visited the clan, and was strenuous in exhorting them to immediate action. They required little incitement to a cause in which every heart was so much interested, and for which every hand was already busied in preparation. These preparations were at length completed. Alleyn, at the head of his party, joined the assembled clan. The Countess for a second time beheld from the ramparts the departure of her people upon the same hazardous enterprise. The present scene revived in her mind a sad remembrance of the past. The same tender fears and the same prayers for success she now gave to their departure, and when they faded in distance from her sight, she returned into the castle dissolved in tears. The heart of Mary was torn by a complex sorrow, and incapable of longer concealing from herself the interest she took in the departure of Alleyn, her agitation became more apparent. The Countess in vain endeavoured to compose her mind. Mary, affected by her tender concern, and prompted by the natural ingenuousness of her disposition, longed to make her the confidant of her weakness, if weakness that can be termed which arises from gratitude, and from admiration of great and generous qualities. But delicacy and timidity arrested the half-formed sentence, and closed her lips in silence. Her health gradually declined under the secret agitation of her mind. Her physician knew her disorder to originate in suppressed sorrow, and advised, as the best cordial, a confidential friend. Matilda now perceived the cause of her grief. Her former passing observations recurred to her memory and justified her discernment. She strove by every soothing effort to win her to her confidence. Mary, oppressed by the idea of ungenerous concealment, resolved at length to unveil her heart to a mother so tender of her happiness. She told her all her sentiments. The Countess suffered a distress almost equal to that of her daughter. Her affectionate heart swelled with equal wishes for her happiness. She admired with warmest gratitude the noble and aspiring virtues of the young Highlander, but the proud nobility of her soul repelled with quick vivacity every idea of union with a youth of such ignoble birth. She regarded the present attachment as the passing impression of youthful fancy, and believed that gentle reasoning, aided by time and endeavour, would conquer the enthusiasm of love. Mary listened with attention to the reasonings of the Countess. Her judgment acknowledged their justness, while her heart regretted their force. She resolved, however, to overcome an attachment which would produce so much distress to her family and to herself. Notwithstanding her endeavours to exclude Alleyn from her thoughts, the generous and heroic qualities of his mind burst upon her memory in all their splendour. She could not but be conscious that he loved her. She saw the struggles of his soul and the delicacy of his passion, which made him ever retire in the most profound and respectful silence from its object. She solicited her mother to assist in expelling the destructive image from her mind. The Countess exerted every effort to amuse her to forgetfulness. Every hour, except those which were given to exercises necessary for her health, was devoted to the cultivation of her mind and the improvement of her various accomplishments. These endeavours were not unsuccessful. The Countess with joy observed the returning health and tranquillity of her daughter, and Mary almost believed she had taught herself to forget. These engagements served also to beguile the tedious moments which must intervene ere news could arrive from Alleyn concerning the probable success of the enterprise. Misery yet dwelt in the castle of Dunbayne, for there the virtues were captive, while the vices reigned despotic. The mind of the Baron, ardent and restless, knew no peace. Torn by conflicting passions, he was himself the victim of their power. The Earl knew that his life hung upon the caprice of a tyrant. His mind was nerved for the worst. If the letter which the compassion of one of his guards, at the risk of his life, had undertaken to convey to the Countess, afforded him a faint hope that his people might yet effect his escape. In this expectation, he spent hour after hour at his grate, wishing, with trembling anxiety, to behold his clan advancing over the distant hills. These hills became at length, in a situation so barren of real comforts, a source of ideal pleasure to him. He was always at the grate, and often, in the fine evenings of summer, saw the ladies, whose appearance had so strongly excited his admiration and pity, walk on a terrace below the tower. One very fine evening, under the pleasing impressions of hope for himself and compassion for them, his sufferings for a time lost their acuteness. He longed to awaken their sympathy and make known to them that they had a fellow prisoner. The parting sun trembled on the tops of the mountains, and a softer shade fell upon the distant landscape. Sweet tranquillity of evening threw an air of tender melancholy over his mind. His sorrows for a while were hushed, and under the enthusiasm of the hour he composed the following stanzas, which, having committed them to paper, he the next evening dropped upon the terrace. Sonnet. Hail to the hallowed hill, the circling lawn, the breezy upland and the mountain stream, the last tall pine that earliest meets the dawn and glistens latest to the western gleam. Hail every distant hill and downland plain, your dew-hid beauties fancy oft unveils. What time to shepherds read or poets strain, sorrowing my heart its destined woe bewails. Blessed are the fairy hour, the twilight shade of evening, wandering through her woodlands dear. Sweet the still sound that steals along the glade, 'tis fancy wafts it, and her votaries hear. 'Tis fancy wafts it, and how sweet the sound! I hear it now the distant hills uplong, while fairy echoes from their dells around, and woods and wilds the feeble notes prolong. He had the pleasure to observe that the paper was taken up by the ladies, who immediately retired into the castle. End of chapter. Chapter 5. One morning early, the Earl discerned a martial band emerging from the verge of the horizon. His heart welcomed his hopes, which were soon confirmed into certainty. It was his faithful people, led on by Alleyn. It was their design to surround and attack the castle, and though their numbers gave them but little hopes of conquest, they yet believed that, in the tumult of the engagement, they might procure the deliverance of the Earl. With this view they advanced to the walls. The sentinels had descried them at a distance. The alarm was given. The trumpets sounded, and the walls of the castle were filled with men. The Baron was present, and directed the preparations. The secret purpose of his soul was fixed. The clan surrounded the fosse, into which they threw bundles of faggots, and gave the signal of attack. Scaring ladders were thrown up to the window of the tower. The Earl, invigorated with hope and joy, had by the force of his arm almost wrenched from its fastening one of the iron bars of the grate. His foot was lifted to the stanchion, ready to aid him in escaping through the opening, when he was seized by the guards of the Baron and conveyed precipitately from the prison. He was led, indignant and desperate, to the lofty ramparts of the castle, from whence he beheld Alleyn and his clan, whose eager eyes were once more blessed with the sight of their chief. They were blessed but for a moment. They beheld their lord in chains, surrounded with guards and with the instruments of death, Animated, however, with a last hope, they renewed the attack with redoubled fury, when the trumpets of the Baron sounded a parley, and they suspended their arms. The Baron appeared on the ramparts. Alleyn advanced to hear him. "The moment of attack," cried the Baron, "is the moment of death to your chief. If you wish to preserve his life, desist from the assault, and depart in peace, and bear this message to the Countess, your mistress. The Baron Malcolm will accept no other ransom for the life and the liberty of the Earl than her beauteous daughter, whom he now sues to become his wife. If she accedes to these terms, the Earl is instantly liberated. If she refuses, he dies." The emotions of the Earl and of Alleyn on hearing these words were inexpressible. The Earl spurned with hearty virtue the base concession. "Give me death," cried he with loud impatience. "The house of Athlin shall not be dishonoured by alliance with a murderer. Renew the attack, my brave people. Since you cannot save the life, revenge the death of your chief. He dies contented, since his death preserves his family from dishonour." The guards instantly surrounded the Earl. Alleyn, whose heart, torn by contending emotions, was yet true to the impulse of honour, on observing this, instantly threw down his arms, refusing to obey the commands of the Earl, a hostage for whose life he demanded, while he hastened to the castle of Athlin with the conditions of the Baron. The clan, following the example of Alleyn, rested on their arms, while a few prepared to depart with him on the embassy. In vain were the remonstrances and the commands of the Earl. His people loved him too well to obey them, and his heart was filled with anguish when he saw Alleyn depart from the walls. The situation of Alleyn was highly pitiable. All the friend virtues of his soul were called upon to support it. He was commissioned on an embassy, the alternate conditions of which would bring misery on the woman he adored, or death to the friend whom he loved. When the arrival of Alleyn was announced to the Countess, impatient joy thrilled in her bosom, for she had no doubt that he brought offers of accommodation, and no ransom was presented to her imagination, which she would not willingly give for the restoration of her son. At the sound of Alleyn's voice, those tumults which had began to subside in the heart of Mary were again revived, and she awoke to the mournful certainty of hopeless endeavour. Yet she could not repress a strong emotion of joy on again beholding him. The soft blush of her cheek showed the colours of her mind, while, in endeavouring to shade her feelings, she impelled them into stronger light. The agitations of Alleyn almost subdued his strength when he entered the presence of the Countess, and his visage, on which was impressed deep distress and the paleness of fear, betrayed the inward workings of his soul. Matilda was instantly seized with apprehension for the safety of her son, and in a tremulous voice enquired his fate. Alleyn told her he was well, proceeding with tender caution to acquaint her with the business of his embassy, and with the scene to which he had lately been witness. The sentence of the Baron fell like the stroke of death upon the heart of Mary, who fainted at the words. Alleyn flew to support her. In endeavouring to revive her daughter, the Countess was diverted for a time from the anguish which this intelligence must naturally impart. It was long ere Mary returned to life, and she returned only to a sense of wretchedness. The critical situation of Matilda can scarcely be felt in its full extent. Torn by the conflict of opposite interests, her brain was the seat of tumult and wild dismay. Whichever way she looked, destruction closed the view. The murderer of the husband now sought to murder the happiness of the daughter. On the sentence of the mother hung the final fate of the son. In rejecting these terms, she would give him instant death. In accepting them, her conduct would be repugnant to the feelings of indignant virtue and to the tender, injured memory of her murdered lord. She would destroy forever the peace of her daughter and the honour of her house. To effect his deliverance by force of arms was utterly impracticable, since the Baron had declared that the moment of attack should be the moment of death to the Earl. honor, humanity, parental tenderness bade her save her son. Yet, by a strange contrariety of interests, the same virtues pleaded with a voice equally powerful for the reverse of the sentence. Hitherto hope had still illumined her mind with a distant ray. She now found herself suddenly involved in the darkness of despair, whose glooms were interrupted only by the gleams of horror which arose from the altar on which was to be sacrificed one of her beloved children. Her mind shrunk from the idea of uniting her daughter to the murderer of her father. The ferocious character of Malcolm was alone sufficient to blight forever the happiness of the woman whose fate should be connected with his. To give to the murderer the child of the murdered was a thought too horrid to rest upon. The Countess rejected with force the Baron's offer of exchange, when the bleeding figure of her beloved son, pale and convulsed in death, started on her imagination and stretched her brain almost to frenzy. Meanwhile, Mary suffered a conflict equally dreadful. Nature had bestowed on her a heart susceptible of all the fine emotions of delicate passion, a heart which vibrated in unison with the sweetest feelings of humanity, a mind quick in perceiving the nicest lines of moral rectitude, and strenuous in endeavoring to act up to its perceptions. These gifts were unnecessary to make her sensible of the wretchedness of her present situation, of which a common mind would have felt the misery. They served, however, to sharpen the points of affliction, to increase their force, and to disclose in stronger light the various horrors of her situation. Fraternal love and pity called loudly upon her to resign herself into the power of the man who, from the earliest dawn of perception, she had contemplated with trembling aversion and horror. The memory of her murdered parent, every feeling dear to virtue, the tremulous but forceful voice of love awakened her heart, and each opposed with wild impetuosity every other sentiment. Her soul shrunk back with terror from the idea of union with the Baron. Could she bear to receive in marriage that hand which was stained with the blood of her father? The polluted touch would freeze her heart in horror. Could she bear to pass her life with a man who had forever blasted the smiling days of him who gave her being? With a man who would stand before her eyes a perpetual monument of misery to herself and of dishonor to her family, whose chilling aspect would repel every amiable and generous affection and strike them back upon her heart only to wound it? To cherish the love of the noble virtues would be to cherish the remembrance of her dead father and of her living lover. How wretched must be her situation when to obliterate from her memory the image of virtue could alone afford her a chance of obtaining a horrid tranquillity. Virtue which is so dear to the human heart that when her form forsakes us, we pursue her shadow. Wherever in search of comfort she directed her aching sight, misery's haggard countenance obtruded on her view. Here she beheld herself entombed in the arms of the murderer. There the spectacle of her beloved brother, encircled with chains and awaiting the stroke of death, arose to her imagination. The scene was too affecting. Fancy gave her the horrors of reality. The reflection that through her he suffered, that she yet might save him from destruction, broke with irresistible force upon her mind, and instantly bore away every opposing feeling. She resolved that since she must be wretched, she would be nobly wretched. Since misery demanded one sacrifice, she would devote herself the victim. With these thoughts, she entered the apartment of the Countess, whose concurrence was necessary to ratify her resolves, and, having declared them, awaited in trembling expectation her decision. Matilda had suffered a destruction of mind which the nature of no former trial had occasioned her. On the unfortunate death of a husband tenderly beloved, she had suffered all the sorrow which tenderness and all the shock which the manner of his death could occasion. The event, however, shocking as it was, did not hang upon circumstances over which she had an influence. It was decided by a higher power. It was decided, and never could be recalled. She had there no dreadful choice of horrors, no evil ratified by her own voice, to taint with deadly recollections her declining days. This choice, though forced upon her by the power of a tyrant, she would still consider as in part her own, and the thought that she was compelled to doom to destruction one of her children harrowed up her soul almost to frenzy. Her mind, at length exhausted with excess of feeling, was now fallen into a state of cold and silent despair. She became insensible to the objects around her, almost to the sense of her own sufferings, and the voice and the proposal of her daughter scarcely awakened her powers of perception. "He shall live," said Mary in a voice broken and tender. "He shall live. I am ready to become the sacrifice." Tears prevented her proceeding. At the word "live," the Countess raised her eyes and threw round her a look of wildness, which, settling on the features of Mary, softened into an expression of ineffable tenderness. She waved her head and turned to the window. A few tears bedewed her cheek. They fell like the drops of heaven upon the withered plant, reviving and expanding its dying foliage. They were the first her eyes had known since the fatal news had reached her. Recovering herself a little, she sent for Alleyn, who was still in the castle. She wished to consult with him whether there was not yet a possibility of effecting the escape of the Earl. In afflictions of whatever degree, where death has not already fixed the events in certainty, the mind shoots almost beyond the sphere of possibility in search of hope, and seldom relinquishes the fond illusion till the stroke of reality dissolves the enchantment. Thus it was with Matilda. After the grief produced by the first stroke of this disaster was somewhat abated, she was inclined to think that her situation might not prove so desperate as she imagined, and her heart was warmed by a remote hope that there might yet be devised some method of procuring the escape of the Earl. Alleyn came. He came in the trembling expectation of receiving the decision of the Countess, and in the intention of offering to engage in any enterprise, however hazardous, for the enlargement of the Earl. He repelled with instant force every idea of Mary's becoming the wife of Malcolm. The thought was too full of agony to be endured, and he threw the sensation from his heart as a poison which would destroy the pulse of life. To preserve Mary from a misery so exquisite and to save the life of the Earl, he was willing to encounter any hazard, to meet death itself as an evil which appeared less dreadful than either of the former. He came prepared with this resolution, and it served to support that fortitude which affliction had disturbed, though it could not subdue. When he came again to the Countess, his distress was heightened by the scene before him. He beheld her leaning on a sofa, pale and silent. Her unconscious eyes were fixed on an opposite window. Her countenance was touched with a wildness expressive of the disorder of her mind, and she remained for some time insensible of his approach. Such is the fluctuation of a mind overcome by stress, that if for a moment a ray of hope cheers its darkness, it vanishes at the touch of recollection. Mary was standing near the Countess, whose hand she held to her bosom. Her present sorrow had heightened the natural pensiveness of her countenance, and shaded her features with an interesting languor, more enchanting than the vivacity of blooming health. Her eyes sought to avoid Alleyn as an object dangerous to the revolution she had formed. Matilda remained absorbed in thought. Mary wished to repeat the purpose of her soul, but her voice trembled, and the half-formed sentence died away on her lips. Alleyn inquired the commands of the Countess. "I am ready," said Mary at length in a low and tremulous voice, "to give myself the victim to the Baron's revenge. I will save my brother." At these words the heart of the Alleyn grew cold. Mary, overcome by the effort which they had occasioned her, scarcely finished the sentence. Her nerves shook, a mist fell over her eyes, and she sunk on the sofa by which she had stood. Alleyn hung over the couch in silent agony, watching her return to life. By the assistance of those about her, she soon revived. Alleyn, in the joy which he felt at her recovery, forgot for a moment his situation and pressed with ardour her hand to his bosom. Mary, whose senses were yet scarcely recollective, yielded unconsciously to the softness of her heart and betrayed its situation by a smile so tender as to thrill the breast of Alleyn with the sweet certainty of being loved. Hitherto his passion had been chilled by the despair which the vast superiority of her birth occasioned, and by the modesty which forbade him to imagine that he had merit sufficient to arrest the eye of the accomplished Mary. Perhaps, too, the diffidence natural to genuine love might contribute to deceive him. It was not till this moment that he experienced that certainty which awakened in his heart a sense of delight hitherto unknown to him. For a moment he forgot the distresses of the castle and his own situation. Every idea faded from his mind but the one he had so lately acquired, and in that moment he seemed to taste perfect felicity. Recollection, however, with all its train of black dependencies, soon returned and plunged him in a misery as poignant as the joy from which he was now precipitated. The Countess was now sufficiently composed to enter on the subject nearest her heart. Alleyn caught with eagerness her mention of attempting the deliverance of the Earl, for the possibility of accomplishing which he declared himself willing to encounter any danger. He seconded so warmly the design, and spoke with such flattering probability of success, that the spirits of Matilda began once more to revive. Yet she trembled to encourage the hopes which hung on such perilous uncertainty. It was agreed that Alleyn should consult with the most able and trusty of the clan, whom age or infirmity had detained from battle, on the means most likely to ensure success, and then proceed immediately on the expedition. Having first delivered to the Baron a message from the Countess, requiring time for deliberation upon a choice so important, and importing that an answer should be returned at the expiration of a fortnight, Alleyn accordingly assembled those whom he judged most worthy of the council. Various schemes were proposed, none of which appeared likely to succeed. When it was recollected that the Earl might possibly have been removed from the Tower to some new place of confinement, which it would be necessary first to discover, that the plan might be adapted to the situation. It was therefore concluded to suspend further consultation till Alleyn had obtained the requisite information, and that in the meantime he should deliver to Malcolm the message of the Countess. For these purposes Alleyn immediately set out for the castle. End of chapter. Chapter 6. The castle of Dunbayne was still the scene of triumph and of wretchedness. Malcolm, exulting in his scheme, already beheld Mary at his feet, and the Earl retiring in an anguish more poignant than that of death. He was surprised that his invention had not before supplied him with this means of torture. For the first time he welcomed love as the instrument of his revenge, and the charms of Mary were heightened to his imagination by the ardent colours of this passion. He was confirmed in his resolves never to relinquish the Earl, but on the conditions he had offered, and thus for ever would he preserve the house of Athlin a monument of his triumph. Osbert, for greater security, was conveyed from the tower into a more centrical part of the castle, to an apartment spacious but gloomy, whose Gothic windows, partly excluding light, threw a solemnity around, which chilled the heart almost to horror. He heeded not this. His heart was occupied with horrors of its own. He was now involved in a misery more intricate and more dreadful than his imagination had yet painted. To die was to him who had so long contemplated the near approach of death a familiar and transient evil, but to see, even in idea, his family involved in infamy and in union with the murderer was the stroke which pierced his heart to its centre. He feared that the cruel tenderness of the mother would tempt Matilda to accept the offers of the Baron, and he scarcely doubted that the noble Mary would resign herself the price of his life. He would have written to the Countess to have forbidden her acceptance of the terms and to have declared his fixed resolution to die, but that he had no means of conveying to her a letter, the soldier who had so generously undertaken the conveyance of his former one, having soon after disappeared from his station. The manly fortitude which had supported him through his former trials did not desert him in this hour of darkness. Habituated so long to struggle with opposing feelings, he had acquired the art of managing them. His mind attained a confidence in its powers. Resistance served only to increase its strength and to confirm the magnanimity of its nature. Alleyn had now joined the clan, and was ardent in pursuit of the necessary intelligence. He learned that the Earl had been removed from the tower, but in what part of the castle he was now confined he could not discover. On this point all was vague conjecture. That he was alive was only judged from the policy of the Baron, whose ardent passion for Mary was now well understood. Alleyn employed every stratagem his invention could suggest to discover the prison of the Earl, but without success. At length, compelled to deliver to Malcolm the message of the Countess, he demanded as a preliminary that the Earl should be shown to his people from the ramparts, that they might be certain he was still alive. Alleyn hoped that his appearance would lead to a discovery of the place of his imprisonment, purposing to observe narrowly the way by which he should retire. The Earl appeared in safety on the ramparts amid the shouts and acclamations of his people. The Baron, frowning defiance, was seen at his side. Alleyn advanced to the walls and delivered the message of Matilda. Osbert started at its purpose. He foresaw that deliberation portended compliance. Stung with the thought, he swore aloud he never would survive the infamy of the concession, and addressing himself to Alleyn, commanded him instantly to return to the Countess and bid her spurn the base compliance, as she feared to sacrifice both her children to the murderer of their father. At these words, a smile of haughty triumph marked the features of the Baron, and he turned from Osbert in silent joy and exultation. The Earl was led off by the guards. Alleyn endeavoured in vain to mark the way they took. The lofty walls soon concealed them from his view. Alleyn now experienced how strenuously a vigorous mind protects its favourite hope. Wayward circumstances may shock, disappointment may check it, but it rises superior to opposition and traverses the sphere of possibility to accomplish its purpose. Alleyn did not yet despair, but he was perplexed in what manner to proceed. In his way from the ramparts, Osbert was surprised by the appearance of two ladies at a window near which he passed. The agitation of his mind did not prevent his recognizing them as the same he had observed from the grates of the tower with such lively admiration, and who had excited in his mind so much pity and curiosity. In the midst of his distress, his thoughts had often dwelt on the sweet graces of the younger, and he had sighed to obtain the story of her sorrows, for the melancholy which hung upon her features proclaimed her to be unfortunate. They now stood observing Osbert as he passed, and their eyes expressed the pity which his situation inspired. He gazed earnestly and mournfully upon them, and when he entered his prison, again inquired concerning them. But the same inflexible silence was preserved on the subject. As the Earl sat one day musing in his prison, his eyes involuntarily fixed upon a panel in the opposite wainscot. He observed that it was differently formed from the rest, and that its projection was somewhat greater. A hope started into his mind, and he quitted his seat to examine it. He perceived that it was surrounded by a small crack, and on pushing it with his hands it shook under them. Certain that it was something more than a panel, he exerted all his strength against it, but without producing any new effect. Having tried various means to move it without success, he gave up the experiment, and returned to his seat melancholy and disappointed. Several days passed without any further notice being taken of the wainscot. Unwilling, however, to relinquish a last hope, he returned to the examination when, in endeavouring to remove the panel, his foot accidentally hit against one corner and it suddenly flew open. It had been contrived that a spring which was concealed within, and which fastened the partition, should receive its impulse from the pressure of a certain part of the panel, which was now touched by the foot of the Earl. His joy on the discovery cannot be expressed. An apartment wide and forlorn, like that which formed his prison, now lay before him. The windows, which were high and arched, were decorated with painted glass. The floor was paved with marble, and it seemed to be the deserted remains of a place of worship. Osbert traversed with hesitating steps its dreary length, towards a pair of folding doors, large and of oak, which closed the apartment. These he opened. A gallery, gloomy and vast, appeared beyond. The windows, which were in the same style of Gothic architecture with the former, were shaded by thick ivy that almost excluded the light. Osbert stood at the entrance, uncertain whether to proceed. He listened, but heard no footstep in his prison, and determined to go on. The gallery terminated on the left in a large winding staircase, old and apparently neglected, which led to a hall below. On the right was a door, low and rather obscure. Osbert, apprehensive of discovery, passed the staircase and opened the door, when a suite of noble apartments, magnificently furnished, was disclosed to his wondering eyes. He proceeded onward without perceiving any person, but having passed the second room, heard the faint sobs of a person weeping. He stood for a moment, undetermined whether to proceed, but an irresistible curiosity impelled him forward, and he entered an apartment in which were seated the beautiful strangers whose appearance had so much interested his feelings. The elder of the ladies was dissolved in tears, and the casket and some papers lay open on a table beside her. The younger was so intent upon a drawing, which she seemed to be finishing, as not to observe the entrance of the Earl. The elder lady, on perceiving him, arose in some confusion, and the surprise in her eyes seemed to demand an explanation of so unaccountable a visit. The Earl, surprised at what he beheld, stepped back with an intention of retiring, but recollecting that the intrusion demanded an apology, he returned. The grace with which he excused himself confirmed the impression which his figure had already made on the mind of Laura, which was the name of the younger lady, who, on looking up, discovered a countenance in which dignity and sweetness were happily blended. She appeared to be about 20. Her person was of the middle stature, extremely delicate and very elegantly formed. The bloom of her youth was shaded by a soft and pensive melancholy, which communicated an expression to her fine blue eyes extremely interesting. Her features were partly concealed by the beautiful luxuriance of her auburn hair, which, curling round her face, descended in tresses on her bosom. Every feminine grace played around her, and the simple dignity of her air declared the purity and the nobility of her mind. On perceiving the Earl, a faint blush animated her cheek, and she involuntarily quitted the drawing upon which she had been engaged. If the former imperfect view he had caught of Laura had given an impression to the heart of Osbert, it now received a stronger character from the opportunity afforded him of contemplating her beauty. He concluded that the Baron, attracted by her charms, had entrapped her into his power and detained her in the castle an unwilling prisoner. In this conjecture he was confirmed by the mournful cast of her countenance, and by the mystery which appeared to surround her. Fired by this idea, he melted in compassion for her surroundings, which compassion was tinctured and increased by the passion which now glowed in his heart. At that moment he forgot the danger of his present situation. He forgot even that he was a prisoner, and awake only to the wish of alleviating her sorrows, he rejected cold and useless delicacy, and resolved, if possible, to learn the cause of her misfortunes. Addressing himself to the Baroness, "If, madam," said he, "I could by any means soften the affliction which I cannot affect not to perceive, and which has so warmly interested my feelings, I should regard this as one of the most happy moments of my life, a life marked, alas, too strongly with misery, but misery has not been useless, since it has taught me sympathy. The Baroness was no stranger to the character and the misfortunes of the Earl. Herself the victim of oppression, she knew how to commiserate the sufferings of others. She had ever felt a tender compassion for the misfortunes of Osbert, and did not now withhold sincere expressions of sympathy and of gratitude for the interest which he felt in her sorrow. She expressed her surprise at seeing him thus at liberty, but observing the chains which encircled his hands, she shuddered, and guessed a part of the truth. He explained to her the discovery of the panel, by which circumstance he had found his way into that apartment. The idea of aiding him to escape rushed upon the mind of the Baroness, but was repressed by the consideration of her own confined situation, and she was compelled with mournful reluctance to resign that thought which reverence for the character of the late Earl and compassion for the misfortunes of the present had inspired. She lamented her inability to assist him, and informed him that herself and her daughter were alike prisoners with himself, that the walls of the castle were the limits of their liberty, and that they had suffered the pressure of tyranny for 15 years. The Earl expressed the indignation which he felt at this recital, and solicited the Baroness to confide in his integrity, and, if the relation would not be too painful to her, to honour him so far as to acquaint him by what cruel means she fell into the power of Malcolm. The Baroness, apprehensive for his safety, reminded him of the risk of discovery by a longer absence from his prison, and, thanking him again for the interest he took in her sufferings, assured him of her warmest wishes for his deliverance, and that if an opportunity ever offered, she would acquaint him with the sad particulars of her story. The eyes of Osbert made known that gratitude which it was difficult for his tongue to utter. Tremulously he solicited the consolation of sometimes revisiting the apartments of the Baroness, a permission which would give him some intervals of comfort amid the many hours of torment to which he was condemned. The Baroness, in compassion to his sufferings, granted the request. The Earl departed, gazing on Laura with eyes of mournful tenderness. Yet he was pleased with what had passed, and retired to his prison in one of those peaceful intervals which are known even to the wretched. He found all quiet, and closing the panel in safety, sat down to consider the past and anticipate the future. He was flattered with hopes that the discovery of the panel might aid him to escape. The glooms of despondence which had lately enveloped his mind gradually disappeared, and joy once more illumined his prospects. But it was the sunshine of an April morn, deceitful and momentary. He recollected that the castle was beset with guards, whose vigilance was ensured by the severity of the Baron. He remembered that the strangers, who had taken so kind an interest in his fate, were prisoners like himself, and that he had no generous soldier to teach him the secret windings of the castle, and to accompany him in flight. His imagination was haunted by the image of Laura. Vainly he strove to disguise from himself the truth. His heart constantly belied the sophistry of his reasonings. Unwarily he had drank the draught of love, and he was compelled to acknowledge the fatal indiscretion. He could not, however, resolve to throw from his heart the delicious poison. He could not resolve to see her no more. The painful apprehension for his safety, which his forbearing to renew the visit he had so earnestly solicited, would occasion the Baroness, the apparent disrespect it would convey, the ardent curiosity with which he longed to obtain the history of her misfortunes, the lively interest he felt in learning the situation of Laura with respect to the Baron, and the hope, the wild hope with which he deluded his reason, that he might be able to assist them, determined him to repeat the visit. Under these illusions, the motive which principally impelled him to the interview was concealed. In the meantime, Alleyn had returned to the castle of Athlin with the resolutions of the Earl, whose resolves served only to aggravate the distress of its fair inhabitants. Alleyn, however, unwilling to crush a last hope, tenderly concealed from them the circumstance of the Earl's removal from the tower, silently and almost hopelessly meditating to discover his prison, and administered that comfort to the Countess and to Mary which his own expectation would not suffer him to participate. He retired in haste to the veterans whom he had before assembled, and acquainted them with the removal of the Earl, which circumstance must for the present suspend their consultations. He left them, therefore, and instantly returned to the clan, there to prosecute his enquiries. Every possible exertion was made to obtain the necessary intelligence, but without success. The moment in which the Baron would demand the answer of the Countess was now fast approaching, and every heart sunk in despair, when one night the sentinels of the camp were alarmed by the approach of men, who hailed them in unknown voices. Fearful of surprise, they surrounded the strangers and led them to Alleyn, to whom they related that they fled from the capricious tyranny of Malcolm, and sought refuge in the camp of his enemy, whose misfortunes they bewailed, and in whose cause they enlisted. Rejoiced at the circumstance, yet doubtful of its truth, Alleyn interrogated the soldiers concerning the prison of the Earl. From them he learned that Osbert was confined in a part of the castle extremely difficult of access, and that any plan of escape must be utterly impracticable without the assistance of one well acquainted with the various intricacies of the pile. An opportunity of success was now presented, with which the most sanguine hopes of Alleyn had never flattered him. He received from the soldiers strong assurance of assistance. From them, likewise, he learned that discontent reigned among the people of the Baron, who, impatient of the yoke of tyranny, only waited a favourable opportunity to throw it off and resume the rights of nature. That the vigilant suspicions of Malcolm excited him to punish with the harshest severity every appearance of inattention, that being condemned to suffer a very heavy punishment for a slight offence, they had eluded the impending misery and the future oppression of their chief by desertion. Alleyn immediately convened a council, before whom the soldiers were brought. They repeated their former assertions, and one of the fugitives added that he had a brother whose place of guard over the person of the Earl on that night had made it difficult to elude observation and had preventing his escaping with them, that on the night of the morrow he stood guard at the gate of the lesser drawbridge where the sentinels were few, that he was himself willing to risk the danger of conversing with him, and had little doubt of gaining him to assist in the deliverance of the Earl. At these words the heart of Alleyn throbbed with joy. He promised large rewards to the brave soldier and to his brother, if they undertook the enterprise. His companion was well acquainted with the subterraneous passages of the rock, and expressed himself desirous of being useful. The hopes of Alleyn every instant grew stronger, and he vainly wished, at that moment, to communicate to the Earl's unhappy family the joy which dilated his heart. The eve of the following day was fixed upon to commence their designs, when James should endeavour to gain his brother to their purpose. Having adjusted these matters, they retired to rest for the remainder of the night, but sleep had fled the eyes of Alleyn. Anxious expectation filled his mind, and he saw, in the waking visions of fancy, the meeting of the Earl with his family. He anticipated the thanks he should receive from the lovely Mary, and sighed at the recollection that thanks were all for which he could ever dare to hope. At length the dawn appeared, and waved the clan to hopes and prospects far different from those of the preceding morn. The hours hung heavily on the expectation of Alleyn, whose mind was filled with solicitude for the event of the meeting between the brothers. Night at length came to his wishes. The darkness was interrupted only by the faint light of the moon moving through the watery and broken clouds which enveloped the horizon. Tumultuous gusts of wind broke at intervals the silence of the hour. Alleyn watched the movements of the castle. He observed the lights successively disappear. The bell from the watchtower chimed 1. All was still within the walls, and James ventured forth to the drawbridge. The drawbridge divided in the centre, and the half next the plains was down. He mounted it, and in a low yet firm voice called on Edmund. No answer was returned, and he began to fear that his brother had already quitted the castle. He remained some time in silent suspense before he repeated the call, when he heard the gate of the drawbridge gently unbarred, and Edmund appeared. He was surprised to see James, and bade him instantly fly the danger that surrounded him. The Baron, incensed at the frequent desertion of his soldiers, had sent out people in pursuit, and had promised considerable rewards for the apprehension of the fugitives. James, undaunted by what he heard, kept his ground, resolved to urge his purpose to the point. Happily, the sentinels who stood guard with Edmund, overcome with the effect of a potion he had administered to favour his escape, were sunk in sleep, and the soldiers conducted their discourse in a low voice without interruption. Edmund was unwilling to defer his flight, and possessed not resolution sufficient to encounter the hazard of the enterprise, till the proffered reward consoled his self-denial, and roused his slumbering courage. He was well acquainted with the subterraneous avenues of the castle. The only remaining difficulty was that of deceiving the vigilance of his fellow sentinels, whose watchfulness made it impossible for the Earl to quit his prison unperceived. The soldiers who were to mount guard with him on the following night were stationed in a distant part of the castle, till the hour of their removal to the door of the prison. It was, therefore, difficult to administer to them that draught which had steeped in forgetfulness the senses of his present associates. To confide to their integrity, and endeavour to win them to his purpose, was certainly to give his life into their hands, and probably to aggravate the disastrous fate of the Earl. This scheme was beset too thick with dangers to be hazarded, and their invention could furnish them with none more promising. It was, however, agreed that on the following night Edmund should seize the moment of opportunity to impart to the Earl the designs of his friends, and to consult on the means of accomplishing them. Thus concluding, James returned in safety to the tent of Alleyn, where the most considerable of the clan were assembled, there awaiting with impatient solicitude his arrival. The hopes of Alleyn were somewhat chilled by the report of the soldier. From the vigilance which beset the doors of the prison, escape from thence appeared impracticable. He was condemned, however, to linger in suspense till the 3rd night from the present, when the return of Edmund to his station at the bridge would enable him again to commune with his brother. But Alleyn was unsuspicious of a circumstance which would utterly have defeated his hopes, and whose consequence threatened destruction to all their schemes. A sentinel on duty upon that part of the rampart which surmounted the drawbridge had been alarmed at hearing the gate unbar, and approaching the wall had perceived a man standing on the half of the bridge which was dropped, and in converse with some person on the castle walls. He drew as near as the wall would permit, and endeavoured to listen to their discourse. The gloom of night prevented his recognizing the person on the bridge, but he could clearly distinguish the voice of Edmund in that of the man who was addressed. Excited by new wonder, he gave all his attention to discover the subject of their conversation. The distance occasioned between the brothers by the suspended half of the bridge obliged them to speak in a somewhat higher tone than they would otherwise have done, and the sentinel gathered sufficient from their discourse to learn that they were concerning the rescue of the Earl, that the night of Edmund's watch at the prison was to be the night of enterprise, and that some friends of the Earl were to await him in the environs of the castle. All this he carefully treasured up, and the next morning communicated it to his comrades. On the following evening the Earl, yielding to the impulse of his heart, once more unclosed his partition, and sought the apartments of the Baroness. She received him with expressions of satisfaction, while the artless pleasure which lighted up the countenance of Laura awakened the pulse of rapture in that heart which had long throbbed only to misery. The Earl reminded the Baroness of her former promise, which the desire of exciting sympathy in those we esteem, and the melancholy pleasure which the heart finds in lingering among the scenes of former happiness, had induced her to give. She endeavoured to compose her spirits, which were agitated by the remembrance of past sufferings, and gave him a relation of the following circumstances. End of chapter.